You think you need to see the value in yourself for others to see the value in you. I think it's an interesting quote worth talking about. So let's do that. It's a bold move opening a video about worthiness with a quote that never mentions the word worthiness. And I promise we'll come back to the quote in a minute, but in order to get started, I want to define a couple of terms and the way that I'm thinking about them in the context of this video to try and make a point. The first is value, which did show up in the quote. And I think value, as I think of it, is an innate property of something. The actual dictionary definition of it is the importance, worth, or usefulness of something. And then worthiness, which I think is subtly different, is defined as the quality of being good enough or suitable. And I think that worthiness, in my eyes, differs from value in the sense that it is the collision of value and perception or context, essentially. So for the purposes of this, when I talk about value, I'm going to be talking about something that I think is innate to a thing. And when I talk about worthiness, I'm going to be adding into that an aspect of perception. This may not be entirely supported by the dictionary definitions, but in my experience, when I think about worthiness, I think about someone deeming something worthy. And so it's useful for me to draw that distinction between the two, but we'll talk a bit more about that as we go a little further. So the reason I'm opening with the quote is that I think the quote is about value and perception of value, aka what I think of as worthiness. Specifically, the quote talks about the disjoint between one's own perception of value and then others' perception of value. And I think that that distinction over the last couple of weeks of thinking about it has helped clarify some things for me that I felt would be really interesting to talk about. So where did this quote come from? Well, it came from this piece of paper right here. And I wrote it down during a call that I had with a couple of my oldest, closest friends. And it was actually something that I said to one of them when I got frustrated by the fact that my perception of their value was being dismissed by them. I was saying something nice and supportive to them, and they were kind of poo-pooing it and calling into question whether or not that was a reality or not. And so in a bit of kind of like a fugue state almost, because they had to remind me what I said right after I said it.
What happened? I blacked out.
I made this retort in order to kind of be like, just because you can't see it, it doesn't mean that it's not there. Ever since then, the quote has been hanging around on its noble envelope, and it's been kind of a brainworm for me in a way. It's been kind of eating away at me, and every time I walk by it, I think a little bit more about it and go, how do I make sense of it? Because it makes intuitive sense to me. I like the phrasing, I like the idea behind it, but I've been struggling with some of the foundations. So let's start decomposing those. So to do that, let's rewind to value again, because I think that it's part of the core of this puzzle. And specifically, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about around value is the lack of an objective measure of value. Short of calculating the elemental weight of the various components of a human body, there's really no objective quantifiable standard for the value of a person. Despite this, I think on a daily basis, we are browbeaten, barraged, buried under an avalanche of society trying to do its best to assign value to us and to everything. Questions like, how big is your paycheck? How many Instagram followers do you have? How good are you at a sport? All of these things contribute to someone's value in the eyes of society. But despite all of these measures, they don't contribute to anything tangible, real, or verifiable, right? They're all part of that second category that we're going to talk about next, which is perception. They are intangible, but things that we as a society have attributed value scales to. In fact, I'd go a step further and say that humans, for the most part, aren't super concerned with innate value, but are incredibly concerned and fixated on perceived value. And a lot of those signals that I just mentioned are measures of perception of value. So this is one of the things that I found particularly interesting about this concept, the concept of perceived value or perception in general. Specifically, what really tickled my fancy, or was an idea that really was satisfying to think about, was the idea that we all have wildly unique perspectives, totally and completely unique to us as human beings. And yet, we are incredibly fixated on the commonality of those perspectives, the homogenization of perspectives, so everyone can kind of be on the same page and see the same things. I'm thinking about classical standards of beauty. What is art? What isn't art? What music is good? What music isn't good? We embrace a certain amount of disagreement around these topics, but we also strive very hard to find objective classifications for them, rather than embracing the total and complete uniqueness of each of our perspectives. And I think that's not completely bad or shouldn't be done. I think it's part of the commonality of humanity, right? I've seen studies about how innate, for instance, music is to all humans. And so there is something very fundamental about us all that ties us together and draws us to music and to be musical beings. But there's one way that our perspectives are especially unique, and that's with regard to ourselves. I think that it's super interesting how asymmetric our view of ourself and our perception of ourself is versus every other person on the planet. I kind of like to think of it like an omniscient narrator in a book. We are the only person in this world who is privy to our inner thoughts, feelings, and perceptions in a way that no one else is. And in that regard, that is a completely unique piece of our experience. Where I think this fits into, say, worthiness is when we talk about certain actions, like you choose to do a good thing for a friend. The friend only experiences the good thing, the fruits of the action. But you, as the omniscient narrator, are privy to how hard it was to get out of bed, how much you doubted whether or not you wanted to do it. All of these additional internal machinations that we use to tear down the value of the action that we took, right? It's not good enough to have done the right thing. You also have to have been excited, motivated, and happy to do the thing in order for the thing to have the innate value that you prescribe to it. It's important to remember that this also goes the other way. We will never be privy to other people's thoughts, feelings, emotions. And so as a result, we only analyze the goodness of those actions. We see someone volunteering and we laud them for how wonderful they are, despite not knowing their motives, their reasons, how difficult it was for them. So this asymmetry creates this incredible imbalance in our perception of ourselves as compared to every other human being on the face of the earth. I think this asymmetry is very much at the root of something that I know I do myself and I see others do, which is skepticism and dismissal of other people acknowledging value in us, right? Someone says, I think you are wonderful for this reason. I think you did an amazing thing. And we dismiss it out of hand because we know too much and also know too little about what others are doing to know that they're struggling in some of the same ways that we are. That skepticism is an interesting thing because if we remove it from the space of value and worthiness, we can talk about skepticism more broadly. I think Humans have a tendency to take the things that they observe as innately true and bring a certain skepticism to everything else. Someone else's perception is flawed, but we believe the things we see with our own eyes with complete and utter confidence. When the skepticism arises, what we usually do is investigate, right? We try to go back to that standard of seeing is believing and try and see the thing, right? We go to the loch to try to see the Loch Ness monster, because if we see it, we can believe it, and otherwise we are skeptical of it. This works reasonably well with Loch Ness monsters or Sasquatches, but it works a lot worse with value, something that is innately intangible that we can never go find. We are incapable of going and finding the way that someone else sees us, their perception of us, their feelings about us, their thoughts about us. Those are things that we can never discover. We can only observe indications of them or what we are told of them. So that poses two big blockades in this investigation. The first is we can't unknow what we already know. We have this omniscience about ourselves, and we will never unknow how difficult it was to get out of the bed knowing that we had to do a favor for a friend. And two, we have no access to the other side of the coin, which is everyone else's experiences, feelings, and thoughts around that same event, action, whatever it happens to be. And this leads to what I see as kind of the most classic and innate dismissal of a statement of worthiness or value, which is, I just can't see it. I understand you feel that way, but I can't see that in myself. And that's the response that I see all too frequently, because if you can't see it, you can't believe it. And if you're trying to evaluate something as ineffable and intangible as value, the lack of evidence outside of people telling you is a scary thing to take on faith. So the question is, what do we do about this? And as you probably know from some of my other videos, I don't have all the answers. I like asking questions, but this seems like a very important question. So let's dig into how to address skepticism. I think there are two logical ways to approach the problem. One is to accept what others tell you, to accept that if someone tells you you are valuable, to believe them and to see the value that they see. This sounds great in practice. I haven't had a lot of luck with it, and I don't know if others necessarily find it easy, but I suspect they don't. The second, and the one that I'm leaning to more, is to accept the asymmetry of perspective and to embrace the fact that others can see things in us that we cannot necessarily see in ourselves. That's what the quote at the beginning of this video was all about. One of the concrete examples of this that I think of pretty frequently is attraction. I think for the most part, except for the most narcissistic 1% of the population, we do not generally find ourselves as attractive as others who are attracted to us find us. So it can be really difficult to see through someone else's eyes, right? You look at yourself in the mirror and you see yourself and you see your flaws, and it can be very challenging to reconcile that with someone else telling you or acting in a way that indicates that they find you attractive. And I think what it comes back to is this idea again of asymmetry. The idea that differing perspectives are not fundamentally conflicting perspectives because we each have our own unique perspective. The fact that two of them differ does not mean that one has to be right and one has to be wrong. And I think at the core of it, finding ways to accept, appreciate, and believe others when they tell us of our value, tell us of our worthiness, is a big first step towards that much higher ideal of seeing and appreciating our worthiness inherently. And so that's something that I'm working on. It's something that I'm thinking about. And I wanted to share that with all of you. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope that you're having a wonderful day. And I hope that you can see and appreciate the value that others see in you. But for now, that's it. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye. Not apotamus. Ponderous.